यस्य ज्ञानदया सिन्धो रगाधस्य नघा गुणाः सेव्यतामक्षयो धीराः सश्रिये चामृताय च. I will now offer a summary of a talk that I recently offered in Mahachulalongkorn University near Ayutthaya province in Bangkok. In this talk I'm going to discuss human rights and how they relate to Buddhism, more specifically how we move from one language to another and from one culture to another, if you wish, especially one religious or philosophical culture to another. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights might be universal in different ways for different people. In fact, if we look at some of the Asian translations of the word universal, they are not consistent. Many of them derive their translation from some Sanskrit term, and we find different things. Vishwa, which perhaps means something akin to the universe. Sakala, which means all, everything, which becomes more than the universe if, for example, we believe in many universes. So Vishwa and Sakala are not the same, maybe. And then we have Jambudvipa as a translation of universal. So that's a little bit more tricky because Jambudvipa is supposed to be a specific continent, and maybe that's a modern usage of the term. But let us ask, for example, if we have a Buddhist word, which is usually called Tridhatuka, maybe. This is composed of three dhatus, the Kama Dhatu, Rupa Dhatu, and Arupya Dhatu, the desire, form, and formless realms, as they're usually translated, or spheres. So do we want to apply this declaration to all the three? And how many Loka Dhatus does it cover? For example, we are in the Sahaloka Dhatu, the field of activity of Buddha Shakyamuni. Do we want this declaration to also cover Amitabha Sukhavati, which is a different Loka Dhatu? So here are some perhaps provocative questions, but just to show that the sense of the universe differs in different cultures. The activity of declaring requires an agent. So who is this authority which does the declaring? And does whosoever this is have authority over the Buddhist community? If so, why? And if the declaration has that authority, does it have more or less authority than what the Buddha has said, or what the Buddhist community believes to be authoritative already in its own terms? Like, for example, the Vinaya or the Tripitaka as a whole. I think this is a legitimate question, because one could say that a universal declaration of human rights partly gains its efficacy from the authority we accord to those who make the declaration. Now, this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in English, and in Sanskrit it is the Universal Declaration of Manava Adhikara. Perhaps the term Manava is not a big problem, and there are other synonyms to be found elsewhere, Manushya, etc., etc. Adhikara, on the other hand, as we will see, is a more complex matter, and the extent to which this is a synonym of right is something open to debate, I think. Adhikara is important for many South Asian languages, which more or less use the Sanskritized term to translate right, so some variant of adhikara. And although the Hindi word adhikar comes from the Sanskrit, In this case, the Sanskrit choice of translating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the term adhikara might well be derived from the choice made in Hindi in the first place. Although I have to say this is guesswork on my part because I haven't checked that. In Tibetan, the choice is me Toptang, and what I can say is that, as far as I know, Toptang is not one of the attested translations for adhikara, but I might be wrong. If it isn't, this is interesting because that means the Tibetan translators of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not decide to follow the Indic traditions in this rendering of a Western concept, an English concept maybe, which is right. Hindi and other North Indian languages are all close to the Sanskrit, and this is even true of some languages which are actually closer to Tibetan, like for example Newar, which uses adhikar. Perhaps even more interestingly, Sherpa and other languages very closely related to Tibetan did not follow the Tibetan terminology, but rather used borrowing from the Sanskrit. And my guess is this is possibly due to influence from the Nepali translation. Marathi and other Indian languages again are very similar. I haven't included Bengali, but I think it's the same. Tamil does not use a borrowing from the Sanskrit. Urimaikal is not a Sanskrit borrowing. Same thing holds for Telugu, also a Dravidic word, and I haven't included it, but the same is true for Kannada actually. Malayalam has an interesting term, namely avakasham, and this term is a Sanskrit term different from adhikara, but partly its synonym and meaning perhaps something more akin to a chance, an occasion, the basic space or occasion for an activity. The Southeast Asian languages use siddhi to translate the word right. This is true at least of three languages, Thai, Lao, and Khmer, and I imagine a relationship between these three translations. My hypothesis is that at one point there was difficulty in deciding what would be the most appropriate term to translate this foreign concept of right, and in the end there was an agreement in one of these three places, most likely I'd imagine Thailand, to translate it as Siddhi, and then the other translations in the neighboring countries followed the same principle. But I think that most Sanskritists and Pali scholars might be a little surprised to find the word siddhi, which usually means something like an accomplishment, used in the sense of a right. Although I do not know exactly why, and I do not know the pre-modern usages within these languages of the term siddhi. Borrowed terms often acquire different meanings in their new setting. Going back to adhikara, since as we have seen this is the main term used in South Asian languages to translate the term right, we could perhaps reflect a little bit on the etymology and usage of this term in the Sanskrit tradition, starting from the Amara. The Amarakosha is a lexicon. Maybe it is the lexicon of Sanskrit language, composed by probably a Buddhist author, Amarasimha. The Mangalacharana, the auspicious beginning that I have chanted earlier, is indeed the first verse of the Amarakosha, and it's a praise of a Buddha. the Amarakosha treats of two terms which concern us, adhikar and adhikrita. Adhikrita would be the past participle, or rather the ktwa form, which is not exactly a past participle, but nevertheless, these two terms are closely related. So, looking at the Amarakosha itself and one of its commentaries at least, may give us some insight into the possible meaning of adhikar. Prakriyatu adhikarasya. This sentence in the Amrakosha establishes the term prakriya and the term adhikara as synonyms, and this synonymity is very well brought out in the etymological explanation offered by the Vyakya Sudha, which explains the suffixes pra and adhi as having more or less the same sense. So, prakarshaya, adhikyasya, I'd say more or less are synonyms. And the Vyakya Sudha also explains kara and kriya both as meaning karanam, so an activity. This incidentally means that the word adhikaranam too should be considered a synonym of adhikara. So the commentary implicitly establishes one more synonym. The other section of the Amarakosha which concerns us is the discussion of adhikrita. Adhikrita means someone who's deputed to something, and here perhaps we are getting even closer to the sense of right, at least the sense of jurisdiction. In other words, if somebody is adhikrita to something, then that is his or her jurisdiction, his proper field of activity. Maybe not exactly what he or she has a right to do, or maybe more, maybe it is what he or she has both a right and a duty to do. So the term is not a perfect synonym, but from this usage we might be able to see a little bit why the choice of adhikar. And the etymology offered here for the prefix adhi gives us some more clues, because it gives the option of interpreting it as a locative sense, in the sense of upari, which I think is not too different from when we say that adhishila shiksha, the training of adhishila, means the training in the context of shila, so making adhi having the same sense as the seven vibhakti. In other words, if we have a term and we want to refer to the location, one way to do so is to add adhi in the beginning of that term. So adhigraham would mean in the house or within the house. And adhishila is a famous example of that. So in that sense, adhikara is the locus or proper context of an action or activity, and we will see that this idea comes back again in grammar, and it's a good key to understand why adhikara becomes the translation of right. In grammar, the first sense of adhikara, or perhaps the most recurrent sense, is that of a rule which still has jurisdiction, although it is not being explicitly repeated. So there might be a word which has been said earlier, but since it is part of an adhikara rule, that rule still has jurisdiction. And here again, we have the idea of the proper context of functioning, or the proper context of activity, which maybe goes in the direction of right, but again, it's not identical to it.